Hello everyone, I am Leontien Talboom and I'm doing a collaborative PhD at the National Archives UK and University College London, and I'm focusing on access to digital material. So my research kind of starts with these digital strategies, which probably a lot of you are familiar with, but these are published by a whole range of different institutions. And they've been around for about 5 to 10 years now. And basically, within these digital strategies, you will find information on how these institutions and organizations plan to manage their digital material. And there's a whole range of stuff discussed in them, from selection to how they want to provide access to them. They talk a lot about like certain computational methods that they would like to apply, and all different types of stuff. However, if you read through them, they don't always reflect what's happening in reality. Just to show a few examples, and just as a disclaimer, these examples are not meant to like bash these archives in any way. They're just like, there's quite a few of them around, just to give an idea of what I'm talking about. So starting out with this from Transport for London. This Olympics is highlighted here because that was the search term I used. But basically, this is, as you can see, if you look down a little bit, it's a physical description. It says it's a PDF, which you can only view within their reading room. So you can access it, but you have to physically go to their reading room to access it. The same is for some of the material from the British Library. Also keep in mind here that copyright or other legislations could play a role in why material is not made available in some ways. But again, the content can only be viewed within the reading room. So you have to, again, physically go to the building to access that material. And then a third example, which is from the National Archives themselves, and actually a project that I worked on with a colleague, is a record that is a public record and should be open and is digital, but you can't access it on the internet, like in a digital environment, but you can also not access it in the reading room. And this kind of led me to my research question, which is like, wait, what's going on here? Like, people these institutions and organizations have certain ambitions of what they would like to do with their collections, but when you look in practice, it doesn't seem to be working. Like, where's that disconnect coming from, and what's happening here? Which leads to my research question, which is what constraints are digital preservation practitioners facing when making digital material accessible? A few things to point out here. First one being digital preservation practitioners. I picked that term because it's not only archivists that make digital material available, like that preserve it and make it available. And I find digital preservation practitioner more encompassing term for everything. And then my focus, of course, is on digital material. It was first off just born digital material, but the digitized material plays such a huge role in these organizations that I can really let it out in that sense. And then accessible, like I'm focusing on the access here. I'm very much aware that there's a strong connection between what is being preserved and therefore what can be made accessible. But the access is the main thing here that I'm looking at. So my approach is 2 parts actually. So I've got my literature review, which I basically went through a whole bunch of themes and a whole bunch of stuff. And then leading on from what I find within this literature, I set up interviews with certain people. I will talk a little bit more about the interviews later on, but I would like to focus on literature review for now, where a number of constraints became very apparent, which I would like to talk to for now, basically. So the first stuff being the digital environment. So what I mean by the digital environment is basically the internet. It used to be like, the internet's great, such a cool place. There's so many cool opportunities on the internet. But it also comes with a lot of new opportunities and possibilities and problems that we have to solve. So one that I always use as an example is that, for example, the National Archives basically make material accessible for everyone. And everyone with physical material or analog material used to be the people who come through your doors, who go through the trouble to basically come and visit you physically in your reading room. However, with the internet, anyone could basically access your material from anywhere in the world at any time, so that everyone is it's a different group now. There's so much more that goes into that. And also another thing with the internet is that it used to be the archivist that would sit in between the material and the user. However, now the internet's kind of like taking in that spot. And what does that mean for the role of the archivist? Like, where does that fit in within that story? Which also can be seen as a constraint here. The second constraint is born digital material, or digital material in general, actually. And what I mean by that is that it's processable. And Carl touched upon this as well within his talk, where he talked about like different levels of representation. This material can be viewed in so many different ways, and like, how do you then preserve it and make it accessible? Like, what approach do you pick? I always like to take the example of Super Mario Bros. to just showcase this. So I hope everyone's familiar with this. But now it's about 30 years old now. But basically, it came out years ago on the original NES. So you could just preserve the actual physical copy of it, and of course you need the game console to play it on. So you could preserve that and say, look, we've preserved this material. However, you could also preserve the code. People could be interested in looking at it from this approach. And on top of that, you could also take into consideration that emulation is very popular now as well. So basically you emulate the game, and you don't necessarily need the original hardware to do that. You could run it on any hardware, to a certain extent, of course, but that's another way of doing it. And then the context around this material is also really interesting. So this is an image of a speed run, which is basically where people try and play the game as fast as possible, and also raises that question around like, what type of metadata and what type of context do you keep around this entity to keep it in the right context? So yeah, it seems quite easy, but then if you look at all the different approaches, it's like, what do we preserve and why do we preserve that over something differently? Or do we preserve everything, which does not sound sustainable, but could also be an option? And then another one here is around the processes that are currently used for born digital material. So I saw this a lot when looking at certifications and looking at OAIS models and that kind of stuff, where a lot of processes at the moment for born digital material are set out with a user in mind. And a lot of the times that user is seen as a human user. So a lot of materials processed in such a way that you could individually view every file, and it would make sense. Every file would make sense by itself. However, with this material being processable, there's actually another way that you could process the material and make it available for more computational methods and stuff. So making it available as data. So there seems to be quite a constraint at the moment with that processing route as well of that material for access. And then the fourth one and the last one is around expectations of users, which is highly influenced by other organizations and institutions or companies within the digital environment. One of them, the most obvious one being Google here. So Google has a search box, which works very well, has a very sophisticated infrastructure under it, and there's enough users that come into an archival setting and expect a similar experience, which in my opinion maybe isn't even the the approach that we would be looking for to emulate like that archival experience of records. But okay, that's and I don't know if it will play, but this clip always makes me laugh. It's from What We Do in the Shadows, and basically they really do not get the approach of Google, and sometimes I feel like that's how users feel when they come within like an archival setting for the first time, which, yeah, I just find it funny. So hopefully it plays. Okay, so that's my literature review and the constraints that come out of that. So based on that, I started setting up a number of interview questions, and I did this in a semi-structured way because I did know that I wanted to ask specific questions, but I didn't want to limit it to just those questions, because there's enough interesting stuff that just comes out when talking to people. So it was semi-structured, and I did it in several stages. So I would do one stage, then reflect upon it, see what I should change, then do another stage, and then on and on, which I did for free rounds. So basically I interviewed 3 different groups. The first one being the digital preservation practitioners. So that's anyone who's preserving digital material. I wanted to talk to. That was the criteria. The second group I talked to was our computational access providers. So what I mean by that is people who make their material as accessible as data. Mainly this is through data sets, sometimes APIs, and sometimes certain platforms where you can access this material in bulk. And this group is a little bit different than the digital preservation practitioners, because a lot of people who you end up talking to are developers, are product managers. So yeah, so you've got that group. And then the third group I talked to were data journalists, where you would be like, wait, why did you talk to these people? Basically, data journalists are really interesting in the sense that they've gone through a similar process as digital preservation practitioners have. So their practice used to be very analog, and now it's digital. But they also have similar ideas around publishing material and being a trusted organization, so I find it really interesting to talk to them to see what they have to say about this and reflect upon what we could learn from them and they could learn from us. So normally I would now go through a few themes from my interviews, but as we're having a workshop and a discussion, I thought it would be fun to pick out a few quotes from my interviews, which I find really interesting, and maybe we can come back to them in the discussion part. So the first one, and just as a disclaimer here, I am very much aware of the fact that I'm taking these quotes sometimes slightly out of context, and that these are coming from people from all different backgrounds. So please keep in mind that some of these quotes may sound a bit, I wouldn't want to say offensive, but they're quite controversial in some ways. You shall see. But the first one came from a digital preservation practitioner who is frustrated by the way that material is currently processed. And she was saying that just because we can do everything doesn't mean we should. Basically, that's what it comes down to. And she just found it really frustrating that everything has to be made so much more, in her opinion, so much more complicated than it actually should have been. The second one is from a developer who basically talked about the digital preservation community and basically said, these are people that don't necessarily understand the topic that they're talking about, and they don't really know how to change it, so they just talk in circles, basically. And this actually came more out of a frustration from that developer, where he wanted to showcase that developers and people with computational skills can really help archives with certain archives and like other institutions that hold digital material in certain ways, and that he finds that a very frustrating interaction sometimes. The third one was around when talking to one of the institutions that have used a bunch of automated automating techniques to improve their process, where basically at a certain point they were like, wait, this is not technical anymore. All the issues that we're running into are ethical. And they spent much more time actually getting the legal requirements correct than they actually spend implementing the technical side of it, which was interesting because I always assumed before starting this that a lot of it came down to computational skills and stuff not being up to a certain standard. But it's ethical as well, basically. And then the last one, and this is where I will finish because I've just seen that I've gone over the 15 minutes, is that basically this comes from the data journalists. Basically what they say is that just because you're a trusted institution or organization doesn't mean that that's enough. So basically he uses, or the data journalist uses the National Archives as the example here, but basically says like, just because you're a big institution and have been around for so long doesn't mean people should trust you. You should prove that you can be trusted. And data journalists do that by a number of ways, by being really transparent, showing what they've processed, where they've gathered the information from, publishing their data sets alongside their articles. And basically if they make a mistake, they publish that, like they publish that mistake and corrections and everything. And basically it's about being active within that field. So I'm going to wrap up here. If you do have any questions, we can discuss them in the discussion part. But otherwise, these are my contact details. So yeah, thank you.